Why, some were buried in our church, and some right where they fell, with no markers to declare their place of rest. But the poppies, they did grow where they were never sown, and to my mind they do declare it best. Next year when the green corn once again turns into gold, and the poppies in the field, they do remind me, like this scar upon my hand, and the blood spilled on this land, and the hungry earth so eager to confine me. For red and gold are royal colors, one is blood and one is power. For I may one day rest by crop-ready church, in golden fields forever will bloom the poppy flower.
This short film looks at the life and deeds of one of the most notorious men in England, who became rich and powerful during an especially troubled time in this nation's history, the English Civil War. What is especially interesting about this man is his local connection. It seems more than likely he was born in Granborough, and during his meteoric rise to one of the highest positions in the land, which he held for 11 years, he left his mark in many of the villages in the surrounding area. The English Civil War started in 1642, when Charles I raised his royal standard in Nottingham. The split between Charles and Parliament was such that neither side was willing to back down over the principles that they held, and war was inevitable. The country split into those who supported the king and those who supported Parliament, the Royalists and the Parliamentarians, also called the Cavaliers and the Roundheads. In June 1645, Oliver Cromwell's new model army inflicted a fatal blow to the king's army at the Battle of Naseby. Charles did not recover from this defeat, and his cause was lost. In 1649, a death warrant was signed, which led to the execution of the king. All those that signed the warrant, as well as those who had helped prepare it, were officially termed as regicides, which literally means king-killers. For the ensuing period of 11 years, parliamentarians ruled the country under the leadership of Oliver Cromwell. Initially this was known as the Commonwealth and was popular, but people turned against it when it later became a military dictatorship called the Protectorate. On the collapse of this interregnum government, interregnum meaning between reigns, and the restoration of the monarchy in 1660 in the form of Charles's son Charles II, the regicides were quickly outlawed and pursued. Many of those caught were barbarically executed or died in prison. Some escaped abroad but were traced and died at the hands of the king's agents. The remainder evaded capture by changing their identity, eventually dying in exile, universally reviled, and all but erased from recorded history. It is important to remember that history is written by the victors, and that stringent efforts were made after the restoration of the monarchy to erase the details of those regicides who briefly held power in this period of English history. One of these regicides came from North Buckinghamshire. He used his power and influence within Cromwell's government to damage local churches with puritanical zeal. The name of this regicide and church destroyer was Cornelius Holland. He is pictured in the satirical cartoon of Cromwell's cabinet, created after the Civil War. No other images of him remain. So what do we know about him? Cornelius Holland was born in about 1599 or 1600. History leaves no detailed account concerning his first years, because most official records of his existence were removed or destroyed. This has led to different accounts of his place of birth. However, the Victorian antiquarian Shearhan suggested in 1862 that Holland was linked to the parish of Granborough when he wrote, "Granborough, infamous for his birth, ought to have some mark of his power and zeal." Based on other evidence, I think he was correct in his assumption that Holland originated from Granborough. He was probably one of the many children born to a Granborough man, Benedict Holland. Benedict's will was written in 1630 and is held in the National Archives, a transcript having been published on the Winslow History website. Benedict appears to have been a relatively successful yeoman, albeit illiterate, who employed an overseer for his land holdings. Interestingly, his will, which was written in Latin on his behalf, does not mention property or land, which might indicate that he was a yeoman tenant. Nor does it mention all of his children, and was the subject of an appeal by his daughter Anne, who was left without bequest. There is no mention of Cornelius. Benedict's wife Helena predeceased him in 1628. Benedict Holland was buried at Granborough on the 30th of June 1634, so he didn't live long enough to see his son Cornelius to rise to become one of the most powerful men in the country. However, Cornelius Holland is not recorded in the Granborough baptismal records, perhaps because the family chose not to baptize him, or because his name was later erased. The last recorded baptism of a child of Benedict and Helena at Granborough was that of Anne Holland, their 8th child, in December 1594. In the zealous post-war witch hunt, when regicides were being hunted down, there was such revulsion and hostility to all those involved that the public records were expunged of references from the original parish record at Granborough. So where does the story of Cornelius Holland start? According to the Chambers Book of Days, published in 1869, Cornelius Holland was a poor boy in court waiting on Sir Henry Vane, by whose interest he was appointed by Charles I keeper of Creslow pastures. Creslow pastures, close to Whitchurch, belonged to the Crown, and they were used for rearing the cattle for the table of the royal household. The pastures were in the custody of a steward or keeper, and it was to this role that Holland was appointed. With his high-level contacts, the upwardly mobile Holland became a Member of Parliament for New Windsor in 1640, just before the start of the Civil War, and subsequently he seems to have been very adept at lining his own pocket. After the formation of the interregnum government, in addition to being keeper of the pastures, he was granted Creslow Manor as a tenant for a term of 18 years. Holland spent large sums rebuilding the manor house in 1646 and 47. In December 1648, only a month or so before the King's execution, Holland was appointed one of the commissioners for bucks, responsible for settling militia throughout England and Wales. In 1650, the year after the King's execution, Holland decided he wanted to be more than a tenant at Creslow Manor, so he bought it and its associated land from the trustees for the sale of the King's lands. He was also given permission by Parliament to keep the rents from the estate, which formerly had been paid to the Crown, thus enhancing his wealth even further. The county of Buckinghamshire was largely on the side of the parliamentarians, although some pockets of royalism did exist. The parliamentarian John Hampden was from Buckinghamshire, known particularly for his significant and successful battle tactics at Aylesbury in 1642. Some villages to the west of the county, Brill and Borstal for example, were under constant conflict for the duration of the war, given their equidistance between the parliamentarian Aylesbury and the royalist Oxford. Holland became a key member of Cromwell's government, and immediately after the King's death in 1649, he was appointed to the Council of State. Thereafter his family home was at Somerset House, although he was Colonel Holland of Creslow when his daughter married in 1659, and he held Richmond House as his country retreat. He was commissary for the garrisons at Whitehall and the Mews, and had an office at the Royal Mint. He had become a powerful and very wealthy man, and seemingly not averse to using his power to advance his personal objectives. The Dictionary of National Biography notes his rewards from Parliament. His services to the Parliament were rewarded by grants of land, both in England and in the Bermudas, while lucrative offices, including the keepership of Richmond Park, were bestowed upon him. He had 10 children and gave one of them a marriage portion of £5,000, which is equivalent to £750,000 today. Somewhere, however, the focus of Holland's journey appears to have shifted from acquiring wealth to inflicting damage on local churches. As well as collateral damage to the churches in the course of the fighting, a few of the Puritans also sought to remove and destroy those physical elements of the churches which they associated with Roman Catholicism and high church policies pursued by Charles I and his Archbishop of Canterbury, William Laud. For many opponents of these policies, Laudianism was effectively creeping Catholicism. Some of this religiously motivated destruction was undertaken in a methodical way, with campaigns of purification or iconoclasm run during the mid-1640s in response to Parliament's policies and statutory regulations called ordinances. In the course of the Civil War, parliamentary soldiers certainly damaged a number of religious buildings, in some cases with a clear anti-Catholic intent, and in line with the broader iconoclastic campaign of the 1640s. The key focus for the iconoclastic attacks were chancels and north aisles, both associated with Catholic worship. During the life of the interregnum government, it passed hundreds of ordinances that became acts after the king's death in 1649. Sometimes there were as many as 5 in one day. In the main, they dealt with raising taxes to fund the military campaign, securing men and horses for regional armies, and dealing with groups of people who did not recognize the authority of the regime. But some also dealt with the imposition of religious and cultural abeyance. 2 in 1643 related directly to the destruction of superstitious images and removing communion tables, or monuments of idolatry and superstition in churches. In 1647, an ordinance was passed for the abolition of holy days and the establishment of days of recreation in lieu of them, basically bank holidays. Theatres and performance of plays were banned, as was the printing of unauthorised pamphlets. An especially unpopular ordinance passed in 1644 was highly critical of the way Christmas was giving liberty to carnal and sensual delights, and ordered it to be kept with the more solemn humiliation. It is not difficult to imagine that with this backdrop of strict puritanical doctrine and the authority for the destruction of monuments of idolatry and superstition, Holland's local campaign to damage chancels, the very centre of the Catholic priest's authority, and north aisles, which had been traditionally used for processional purposes in the Catholic Church, falls into perspective. full extent of Cornelius Holland's rampage is not recorded, but we know it encompassed the partial demolition of the chancels of Granborough, East Claydon, Winslow and Addington, the destruction of the abandoned churches of Hogshaw and Creslow, and it is probable Holland was behind the demolition of the north aisle at Oving Church. To demonize him further, some later accounts record him as having completely destroyed these churches, something that is still being repeated in modern times. The 2022 Granborough Neighbourhood Plan, for example, says, "The ancient church, dedicated to St John the Baptist, was demolished by Cornelius Holland the regicide during the Civil War, but was rebuilt soon after in 1685 upon the restoration of monarchy. It is impossible that the church we see today in Granborough was totally rebuilt in 1685. The evidence suggests that, as with other churches, the damage was partial, and the repairs can be seen to contrast with the original undamaged medieval parts of the structure. The geographical pattern of these damaged churches clearly suggests that they were directed by someone with local knowledge, such as Cornelius Holland. As a Privy Councillor in Cromwell's interregnum government, and having been entrusted with the deployment of militia throughout the county, Holland certainly had access to ordnance and troops, the very tools he needed for his demolition. To this day, the exterior nave wall of East Claydon Church bears the marks of stray cannon shot from when the chancel was destroyed. But all this wealth and power was destined to be lost, and when Charles II inherited his late father's throne, it brought a dramatic end to Holland's high-rolling days. As one of the 135 commissioners in the Commonwealth government, Holland was assumed to have been one of the 59 commissioners who had prepared and or signed King Charles's death warrant in January 1649, and these regicides were hunted down mercilessly. Holland escaped certain execution by fleeing to Lausanne in Switzerland. Ostentatious to the end, it was said he made his escape in a coach rather than on horseback. Living under an assumed name, he eventually died in exile in Lausanne, stripped of his wealth and power. He was not alone in his flight to Swiss exile. Of those regicides who escaped the country, 7 fled to Switzerland. Over the years, repairs would gradually restore or conceal most of the damage to the local churches, leaving only traces of evidence of the desecration wrought in the middle of the 17th century by the Granborough church destroyer.